I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. The coronavirus can be insidious. People usually recover well, but some develop post-COVID syndrome. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
When symptoms like fatigue, joint pain, brain fog, and shortness of breath last for months, patients become exhausted and disheartened. These long haulers want to overcome this chronic condition.
In the past, people with lasting symptoms following a bout of Lyme disease felt abandoned. Mainstream medicine had little to offer, so they looked elsewhere.
A doctor who overcame chronic Lyme disease offers his insights on non-drug approaches that may help.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, find out which lessons from chronic Lyme disease might help those coping with long COVID.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, has the National Football League figured out practical strategies to prevent the transmission of COVID-19? Football is big business. In 2019, the 32 teams in the NFL brought in over $15 billion. It's hardly any wonder that the league has a vested interest in determining what works and what doesn't when it comes to preventing COVID-19. Research demonstrates there's nothing magic about 15 minutes or 6 feet when it comes to contracting COVID-19. Experts had warned us that being within 6 feet of an infected individual for at least 15 minutes constituted a high-risk exposure, but the NFL, which tested its players repeatedly, found those guidelines didn't hold up. The testing included genomic analysis that made it possible to connect who got the coronavirus from whom.
An outbreak among the Tennessee Titans that involved 21 individuals found that a dozen of them had no interactions of at least 15 minutes consecutively with an infected person. 7 had no interactions that added up to 15 minutes, but meeting without masks, especially in a small, poorly ventilated space, was especially risky. An unmasked, shared car ride proved far riskier than an outdoor meeting with masks. Once the NFL figured this out, it took its contact tracing and quarantine precautions to the next level. Dr. Alan Sillis, the NFL's chief medical officer, sums up the most dangerous activities as meeting, eating, and greeting. The intensive protocols the league adopted got the teams to the Super Bowl. Following these guidelines might get the rest of the country to the other side of the pandemic.
The SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 has been mutating. A number of variants from the UK, South Africa, and Brazil have scientists concerned. The British variant B.1.1.7 is highly contagious. A different variant of the coronavirus, first identified in South Africa, has a mutation called E484K. Vaccines may be less effective against this mutation. A variant that has arisen in Brazil also carries the E484K mutation. Now, the UK variant appears to have acquired the E484K mutation in a few samples as well. Coronaviruses that combine high transmissibility and reduce susceptibility to immune defenses could make the pandemic harder to control because people may become reinfected.
As worrisome as the variants may be, there is some good news on the vaccine front. Researchers in the UK report that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that reduces serious illness and deaths from COVID-19 also helps cut transmission of the virus. Investigators swab trial volunteers every week after they got their first shot. The preliminary analysis suggests that the vaccine could be slowing the spread of the virus. Ongoing clinical trials also show that a span of 3 months rather than 3 weeks between the initial shot and the booster increases effectiveness. Efficacy of 55% when the 2 shots are less than 6 weeks apart rises dramatically to 82% when the shots are 3 months apart.
Influenza cases are exceptionally low this year. A new report from the UK suggests that cases of the flu are lower than they've been for more than a century. The Royal College of General Practices reports that out of 3.9 million patients being monitored, only 35 tested positive for influenza. Measures designed to control COVID-19, such as travel restrictions, school closures, mask requirements, limits on gatherings, and working from home, have limited the spread of influenza.
If your gums bleed when you brush your teeth, it could be a sign you need to see your dentist. Bleeding gums can be a sign of periodontal disease. New research indicates that increasing vitamin C intake might also help. A meta-analysis of 15 clinical trials shows that bleeding gums and retinal bleeds can be a red flag for low vitamin C blood levels. A supplement of 100 to 200 milligrams a day, or foods like peppers, kiwi, or citrus fruits rich in vitamin C might help. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Over 25 million Americans have contracted COVID-19. Most have recovered, but a surprising number have lasting complications. Physicians call this condition post-COVID syndrome, or PCS. People with symptoms may refer to themselves as long haulers. To better understand how an infection can lead to lasting problems, we're talking today with a physician who himself experienced lingering Lyme disease. As a result, he has spent years working on how to help people with chronic post-infectious symptoms.
We're talking with Dr. Bill Rawls. He's a physician who overcame Lyme disease through natural herbal therapy. Dr. Rawls has written extensively on Lyme disease, fibromyalgia, and chronic immune dysfunction. He's the author of Suffered Long Enough and Unlocking Lyme. His blog post is My Chronic Lyme Journey. Dr. Rawls serves as medical director for Vital Plan, an herbal supplement and wellness company he co-founded with his daughter Braden.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Bill Rawls.
Oh, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Rawls, we are all just totally fed up with this COVID-19 virus. But there's a problem, and that is there are some people who have lingering symptoms, and they've not just lasted a couple of weeks. People have recovered, but then their symptoms go on and on. They've been called long haulers or long COVID, and those symptoms can be devastating. Dizziness, forgetfulness, brain fog, fatigue, cough, and of course the seminal symptoms, loss of smell, loss of taste. Now, you've actually had some experience with a chronic ailment as a result of an infection. Can you tell us a little bit about your story and why it might relate to long COVID?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It's been a journey. It's really been an interesting journey that beyond just trying to save my own health, it has been just this fascinating experience of discovery of understanding chronic illnesses in general. But I was my life was disrupted midstream when I was in my late 40s by all kinds of systemic symptoms that I eventually determined was associated with the microbes that we defined as Lyme disease, but found that it was really much bigger and more interesting than that. So not only in my practice through helping patients, but through just a decade-long search over the past, just studying these really interesting chronic infections and how they connect with chronic illness, chronic symptoms, and where the connections are between microbes in the immune system and things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and how that's very similar to chronic Lyme disease. So it's been fascinating, to say the very least. But when COVID came along, it carried that experience even further, following it from the very beginning and just looking at the nature of how people were being infected. I expected that we were going to see some people with long-term convalescence and symptoms that mimicked some of these other illnesses. And lo and behold, 6 months into it, we started hearing about these cases. So it was enough to really dig into the research to understand not only what's going on with coronavirus, but how microbes in general, what their strategies are and how that affects our lives. So,
well, Dr. Rawls, I do have a question about infectious diseases in general, and in particular, the specialists who deal with infectious diseases. The medical profession has had a hard time with chronic Lyme disease. There have been a lot of doctors who have said, it doesn't exist. It's all in people's imaginations. Other people have said, well, yeah, it may exist, but we don't know what to do about it. Yeah. So how have your colleagues dealt with not just chronic Lyme disease, but chronic conditions associated with infections in general? Because normally we think, oh, you caught pneumonia. Well, we'll give you penicillin. 2 weeks later, you'll be perfect.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things there that I have found to be a disconnect is our medical professionals don't understand the difference, or they don't seem to connect with the difference between an acute infection and a chronic infection. And it really gets around to just asking, well, what does the microbe want? Why is it trying to invade our body? And we focus on the symptoms and we focus on just being sick, but we don't necessarily focus on that why, which is so important in everything.
So, Dr. Rawls, what does a microbe want? Different microbes might want different things, mightn't they?
Yeah, and they want to get inside our body because the cells of our body are just this wonderful resource for microbes. So basically what they want is nutrients. And they, all of the microbes that we deal with are host dependent. So they have to get all their nutrients from some kind of host, which means they have to get inside the host body to do that. And our cells offer all the nutrients that microbes need, but our cells also offer a protective environment. So many of the things that we're talking about, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, yeast, are intracellular. They live inside cells. So they have to get inside the cell. But once they're there, they have this protective environment that they're shielded from the immune system, and they can basically just cannibalize the cell's resources to make more microbes. So it's a really wonderful thing for microbes to be able to do. So they all want to get at our cells. And that's been the fascinating research that I've been uncovering in the past 5 years, really, how the microbes are getting inside the body and what happens when that happens. So we think of coronavirus as a respiratory virus, right?
Yeah, that's how we think of it.
Right. But really, what we're looking at with any of these microbes is that's the entry point. That's the way the microbe chooses to try to enter the body. And you look at skin and intestinal barriers, those are pretty thick barriers, but lungs, that's a weak barrier. So if they can ride in on air droplets, and it turns out that, there are a lot of respiratory infections, and historically, respiratory infections have been one of the biggest killers there have ever been as far as our confrontations with microbes. But when they come in to the lungs, they may have a thin barrier, but they hit headlong against the full forces of the immune system. So a battle basically occurs right on that site. And that's what we call pneumonia. And so it's that confrontation that so many physicians look at as the main battle with the microbes. But that's not what they really want. They just want to get through that barrier and into the body. Because if they can hit the bloodstream they can, and different microbes use different techniques of catching red and white blood cells or traveling in the bloodstream, that they can just disperse throughout the body and pepper our tissues. And that's what's happening with the Lyme disease microbes, with coronavirus, with so many other things, mycoplasma, Epstein-Barr. So if they can get in the door, and that's what's unique about ticks, is they get through that barrier without a battle. So that tick injects the microbes directly across the skin, that major barrier, into the bloodstream, right where they want to be. So a lot of times people can pick up tick-borne microbes and not even know it, because there isn't that initial confrontation like we see with coronavirus. And I think that's just a really interesting way to think about these things.
Now, when we talk about tick-borne microbes, of course, we're talking primarily of Borrelia burgdorferi, which causes Lyme disease, but there's a big bunch of others that we may not recognize so easily. Isn't that right?
It's so much bigger than most people recognize. That's my world and where I've been for the past decade. Yeah, so when you look at Borrelia, the microbe associated with Lyme disease, Borrelia burgdorferi is the one that we talk about most. But there are actually now 21 different species of Borrelia that have been recognized worldwide that can cause Lyme disease type symptoms or similar illnesses. And the list keeps growing every year. And then there's Babesia and Rickettsia and Anaplasma and so many others. And what I'm finding is the things that we're testing for are just scratching the surface. So when you look at microbes that have similar characteristics to the microbes that cause Lyme disease, not necessarily all carried by ticks. We pick up a lot of things through our lifetime, but I researched microbes that could cause Lyme disease type symptoms, but could be present in the body without causing illness. And I came up with over 100 different microbes, and that may just be scratching the surface. There's so much out there we don't know about. And I think that is the key to how to think about these things very differently.
You're listening to Dr. Bill Rawls, a physician who overcame Lyme disease through natural herbal therapy. His books include Suffered Long Enough and Unlocking Lyme. His blog post is My Chronic Lyme Journey.
Lyme disease is quite different from COVID-19, but the lingering symptoms like fatigue, joint pain, headache, and brain fog overlap.
What can long haulers learn about coping with their condition from people who have wrestled with chronic Lyme?
After the break, how can a virus cause so much misery as we see with long COVID?
Dr. Rawls' experience with a chronic infectious disease can give us some hints on how to cope with chronic COVID.
Sometimes pathogens can hibernate or hide in our bodies for extended periods of time.
How did Dr. Rawls overcome his chronic Lyme condition?
What herbs did he use, and how much of the chronic effects are due to the lingering germs, and how much to the immune system reaction?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code PEOPLES25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. Cocovia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is PEOPLES10. Learn more at cocovia.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocovia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Most people think that they're either healthy or they're sick. But is it possible for seemingly healthy people to harbor pathogens that cause subtle health problems? Could these germs be hiding where medical tests can't detect them easily? Not long ago, most physicians assumed that we didn't have bacteria, viruses, or fungi living in our tissues, except for the digestive tract. Now we know that almost every part of the human body has its own microbiota. What are the implications?
Our guest today is Dr. Bill Rawls, a physician who overcame Lyme disease through natural herbal therapy. His books include Suffered Long Enough and Unlocking Lyme. His blog post is My Chronic Lyme Journey.
Dr. Rawls, you've talked eloquently about how the virus, in particular the COVID-19 virus, gets into our bodies initially through our respiratory system, through our nose, through our mouth, and then into our lungs. But once in our lungs, it can get into our bloodstream. And when you think about the symptoms that are associated with long COVID or the long haulers, things like loss of smell, loss of taste, dizziness, headache, forgetfulness, memory problems, brain fog, difficulty paying attention, fatigue, insomnia, fevers, heart racing, shortness of breath, diarrhea. I mean, these are symptoms throughout the body. How is it that this virus, SARS-CoV-2, can cause so much misery for so long?
Yeah, interestingly, it's the same way that so many other microbes cause similar kinds of symptoms. And again, what these microbes want, what these viruses want, is to get inside the body and to get at the cells of our body that aren't as well protected by the immune system. So they're looking for every opportunity. And interestingly, that was something that was fascinating to find, that there was research that showed that these viruses can travel down the olfactory nerve into the brain tissue directly. That bypasses that lung route, so they can just travel through the nose right through that pathway. And that's why people lose their sense of smell and taste. And I found that to be fascinating, but it's not the only virus that does that. There is evidence that other viruses, other bacteria use some of those pathways of traveling through nerves to get to the brain, because that's just a really nice area to invade cells. But in addition to that, the microbes are traveling through the bloodstream. And we don't know all the ways that coronavirus does that yet. But if you look at other viruses and other bacteria, they have really interesting ways of staying alive inside white blood cells. So when they enter the body and enter the bloodstream, the white blood cells gobble up the microbes, but the microbes aren't killed. They stay alive and they persist. And I was reading an article last week that even suggested that they could possibly even steer the white blood cell toward tissues that they want to go to. So that is basically a vehicle. They call it a Trojan horse mechanism, that they are delivered into brain tissue. and into all the tissues in the body. So we have all these diverse symptoms. So at first, when they were looking at long COVID symptoms, they thought it was just the systemic symptoms were just an inflammatory response. But it does appear that it actually, the virus is traveling. So on autopsy specimens, they have found it in brain, in heart, in muscle, in kidneys, in liver, virtually throughout the body.
Now, Dr. Rawls, when we started our conversation today, we referred to the fact that you have personal experience with a chronic infectious problem. Yours was caused by Borrelia burgdorferi. Would you tell us about your experience, please?
Absolutely. I think I was probably harboring these microbes since I was a child. I spent my whole youth in the woods, and, tick bites were just an everyday affair. And this idea that some ticks carry Borrelia and some ticks don't is true, but all ticks carry hundreds of microbes. One tick species was found to have 237 different families of microbes, of bacteria that it could carry. So all ticks have enormous numbers of bacteria and other microbes. And these things, many of them have the potential to cause illness. So it's not just Borrelia. But these things, if your system is healthy, you can harbor these things in your system for years. And I did. It wasn't until my body was starting to suffer from the effects of prolonged stress, of doing obstetric call for 20 years, every second to third night, and just pushing all the stress buttons, not sleeping, not eating properly. And so another thing that I found in my research is that stressed cells are more vulnerable to invasion by microbes. So it's not just the immune system that protects us. When our cells have defenses that help protect the cell from being invaded by microbes and taking care of the microbe if they make it through the cell membrane. So if your cells are healthy, you're less vulnerable to these kinds of infections. If your cells are stressed, you're a lot more vulnerable. And if your cells are vulnerable, that means a lot more work for your immune system, and your immune system is eventually going to get overtaxed, and these things are going to start to flourish. So, those microbes had been there, and I think not just Borrelia, but Mycoplasma, and every Lyme patient I talk to, they come with a list of different co-infections, not necessarily things they picked up with a tick bite. We pick up Mycoplasma pneumoniae and Chlamydia pneumoniae when we're children. And there's now evidence that these things can stay dormant in our tissues and never really leave us. So it's a really, really interesting way to look at this whole thing and start to look at some possible connections to chronic illnesses.
Well, Dr. Rawls, it's so interesting because we know that there are certain kinds of infections that do, in quotes, linger. And infectious disease experts have no problem with that. For example, herpes.
Yeah.
We know that people can develop herpes infections and have cold sores, and sometimes when they're stressed or when they get too much sun or some other situation that will cause an outbreak, and that virus migrates down from the brain to our lip, and we have an outbreak, and after a week or two it eventually goes away. We even have antiviral drugs. Same thing for chickenpox. Again, a herpes virus that we now have a vaccine for. But the idea that these viruses can hibernate, if you like, in our cells, in our ganglia, and then be activated after decades. We now know about the microbiome. It's not just in our digestive tracts. There are bacteria and viruses and fungi all over our bodies, including in our lungs. And I think that came as a great surprise to your colleagues having thought that, oh, the lungs must be sterile, the brain must be sterile. There's even a suggestion that maybe some dementias may be related to viral infections. So help us understand how people can deal with these chronic infections that may be hibernating, these viruses, or even in some cases bacteria, for not just a few weeks or a few months, but for years.
Yeah, and what it boils down to is we all have them, and it is much bigger than you can imagine. There were two studies one in 2016, one in 2017, that one study was looking at Alzheimer's brains, another was looking at multiple sclerosis brains, two independent studies. Autopsy studies, so they were looking for microbes in brains, and what they found was astounding. Every specimen contained hundreds of microbes. But what was even more startling was that they did control studies of people who had died of something other than a neurodegenerative illness. They found hundreds of species in those brains too, every single specimen, implying that we actually have a microbiome of the brain. The difference was that the disease brains had more inflammatory microbes and higher concentrations of microbes, which means the cells were weak, and these microbes that were already there, were flourishing. And from there, I found that our gut microbes readily cross through our gut, especially if we have a disruption of gut flora, and they end up in the brain and all over. So we've got microbes circulating all through our body. And you really depend on healthy cells and a healthy immune system to keep these things in check and stay well.
Now, Dr. Ross, how did you overcome the chronic Lyme condition that you were suffering with?
When I learned it was Lyme disease, which I had been struggling with for years of trying to figure out what it was. First it was, is it chronic fatigue? Is it fibromyalgia? Do I have multiple sclerosis? Because there's so many cross symptoms. But once I found out it was Lyme, it's like, oh, good. Now, finally, I've got something I can treat, and I can just go take antibiotics and I'll be fine. Except the antibiotics made me terrifically ill because antibiotics disrupt flora. And so ultimately, I turned to herbal therapy. After exploring every possibility that might work, I embraced herbal therapy and aggressively used herbal therapy for many years. And I still take herbs every day. And the herbs restored my health completely.
What herbs were they? And is there research that would back that up?
Actually, there is some new research. At the time, there was very little. There were just reports of thousands of people that had gotten better with certain herbs. And there are actually a lot of herbs that we can use. But my basic protocol was a collection of herbs that included Japanese knotweed, cat's claw, Chinese skullcap, reishi mushrooms, cordyceps, and andrographis. So those were just a few of the herbs in pretty significant quantities. So mainly it was just looking at antimicrobial properties of herbs and moving on from there. And I had an extraordinary response and really immersed my life into the study of the antimicrobial properties of herbs and how they can affect our bodies. But recently, last year, there was a study from Johns Hopkins University where they looked at some of those commonly used herbs for Lyme disease, and they found that 6 herbs had and this was a test tube study because they wanted to not involve the effect the herbs might have on the immune system. So this was basically just putting the herbs in a test tube with Borrelia bacteria. And what they found was that 6 herbs, and included on that list was Japanese knotweed, cat's claw, and Chinese skullcap, were able to kill Borrelia more specifically and more effectively than commonly used antibiotics, doxycycline and azithromycin. And that study, that one got my attention.
I would think so.
Now, Dr. Rawls, you've talked about killing the bacteria, but for many people, it may be an inflammatory reaction from the immune system itself. And we know that what what often kills people with COVID-19 is the cytokine storm, the body's immune system just going over the top. And I'm wondering about chronic Lyme disease and maybe chronic conditions associated with other infections. How much of it is the bacteria, the virus, or the other microbes, and how much of it is the immune system becoming, if you like, overactive?
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing right there, and that we really ask that question of what is inflammation? What is chronic inflammation? And this is one that I really dug into because for most of my career, we use that word a lot, but I didn't really know what it meant. It was kind of nebulous. So when you look at that word chronic inflammation and the damage done, you have to consider that these microbes it's not an invasion like in the lungs, like a pneumonia. They're beyond that. They are basically peppered into normal tissues. So if you can imagine normal brain or normal heart muscle with normal cells, and you have just micro cells that have been infected by microbes peppered throughout those tissues. So you have to think about it this way, that if the immune system uses big guns, all-out invasion to try to root those microbes out, it's going to kill all the normal cells. So that's where the adaptive immune system comes in to use antibodies and targeted immune cells to take out those cells that have been infected with microbes from all the normal cells. But there's always some collateral damage. So when you have increased microbe activity, you have increased cellular die-off. And when cells die, they create debris. When they create debris, it blocks flow of nutrients and water and oxygen to healthy cells, and they get stressed. So the immune system has to come in with cells called macrophages that are the garbage collectors to clean that debris up. But they use potent acid and free radicals to do that. So you have microbes that are infecting cells, but that's turning over more cells, more debris, more macrophages. So you call in reinforcements with cytokines, more acid, more free radicals, more damage to healthy cells, more, and then you have weak cells that are being invaded by microbes. That's what chronic inflammation is. So yeah, it's that whole process that's going on that's doing the damage. So it is as much the immune system trying to solve this problem as it is the microbes themselves.
You're listening to Dr. Bill Rawls, a physician who overcame Lyme disease through natural herbal therapy. His books include Suffered Long Enough and Unlocking Lyme. His blog post is My Chronic Lyme Journey.
Many people assume that if they catch COVID-19 and get over it, they're one and done. It comes as a terrible shock to discover that symptoms such as loss of the senses of taste and smell, shortness of breath, fatigue, joint pain, muscle aches, irregular heartbeats, and sleep problems might last for months.
There are no approved medications for treating post-COVID syndrome. That's why the non-drug approaches that Dr. Rawls discovered for his lingering Lyme symptoms are so interesting.
After the break, we'll learn more about long COVID.
Sometimes people imagine that young people are immune, but they too can get very sick with long COVID.
Is there a way to get the chronic immune reaction under control?
Is there anything people can do as they recover from COVID-19 to reduce their chance of suffering long COVID?
What herbs did Dr. Rawls use successfully? Will they help long COVID?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This podcast is brought to you by the Verrazana Health Club. This comprehensive home testing service enables you to track crucial health markers of gut health, inflammation, metabolism, hormones, thyroid function, and many other organ systems. Regular testing can help detect health imbalances before they lead to sickness. Online at Verrazana, VERISANA.com/health-club. Get 50% off the first month with the discount code PEOPLE50. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Today we're talking about coping with long COVID. When symptoms linger for weeks or months after a person has recovered from the acute infection, patients may become frustrated. Their family members and their primary care providers may not understand what they're going through.
Younger people are assumed to be relatively resistant to COVID-19, but they can become infected with the virus and they can become extremely ill. In addition, even people who do not need hospitalization may have a hard time recovering from the long-term effects of the coronavirus.
What lessons can we learn from someone who has overcome chronic Lyme disease? What non-drug approaches might be helpful?
We are talking with Dr. Bill Rawls, a physician who overcame Lyme disease through natural herbal therapy. His books include Suffered Long Enough and Unlocking Lyme. His blog post is My Chronic Lyme Journey.
Dr. Rawls, bringing the conversation to long COVID, we understand that you know someone named Catherine who has had an experience with this. Would you tell us her story, please?
Yeah, Catherine was someone that we met. I do consults for people all over the country with different kinds of chronic conditions. And I talked to Catherine, and she was a pretty typical long COVID sufferer, sophomore in college, active, was preparing for a marathon, really healthy, and got COVID and got sick from it, but not enough to be hospitalized, and just never really got well from it. She lost her sense of smell and immediately started having the brain fog, the neurological symptoms, and just but also the continuation of the respiratory symptoms of just feeling like she couldn't breathe and an elephant was sitting on her chest, but systemic symptoms of fatigue, and was miserable. And so that's, she was really struggling. And it's very typical that so many people with long COVID don't necessarily become ill enough to be hospitalized. And some don't become very ill at all. But again, if that virus has the ability to get inside the body and spread through the body and take hold, then cells throughout the body start becoming disrupted, and you start getting systemic inflammation, which drives all of these symptoms.
Now, Dr. Rawls, before you go into more detail about Catherine, I'd like you to address this notion that younger people can become sick as well as older people. Because we know that people over the age of 65, 75, especially 85, are especially vulnerable to COVID-19. And that's where most of the deaths have been. But we've heard from a lot of people who are, quote unquote, young and healthy in their teens, in their early 20s, in their 30s. They may be runners. They exercise regularly. They take care of themselves. And they seem to get over COVID-19. And then there's this long haul effect that you're describing with Catherine. A lot of the people who have commented on our website say, 99% of people get over it. It's no big deal. But for some people, they may get over it, but it is a big deal.
I think so. And that's what makes this virus so significant compared to many other things out there is it's so unpredictable at this point. And yes, you would expect that elderly people or people with comorbid conditions, their cells aren't well, so their cells are more vulnerable to invasion. They're going to have a worse time of it with respiratory infections and be at more risk of problems in general. But yeah, the big surprise is the young people that are getting hit by this thing. And it's not really unique to COVID, though. I was able to research that all of the big influenza pandemics in the past, we've had the same sort of thing, that people have a long, prolonged convalescence, and many of them just never really get full health back again. So it has to do with that virus getting inside. And if it can slip past the immune system's first offense barriers, then, it peppers those cells. And if it gets the upper hand for whatever reason, and that could be genetics, it could be other stress factors going on. But if it gets set up in cells and you get that chronic inflammation going, wow, it can be really debilitating. And considering that I've seen upwards of 1 in 20 people out of all the people, millions of people worldwide, and 1 out of 20 could potentially end up this way. That's big. And it's definitely something that suggests that we should be doing everything we can to protect ourselves in every way.
Dr. Rawls, how is Catherine doing now?
Getting better. She is on an herbal protocol and gradually getting better. I feel like the herbs are probably helping, but a lot of people do gradually get better over time. She radically changed her health habits. It's basically taking care of yourselves, So good diet, clean environment, low stress, the right kind of physical activity that doesn't stress her body. All of those things are remarkably important. And I see a lot of value in herbal therapy just to supporting the recovery systems of the body.
Well, I'm curious about the immune system piece of all of this, because it seems like, the porridge and the three bears, because not too hot, not too cold. It has to be just right. And so you want the immune system to fight off the virus or the bacteria or the fungi or whatever it is that has caused the problem. But then you want the immune system to calm down so that it's not in a constant state of battle.
Yeah.
And it seems like this ongoing inflammatory reaction is in part the immune system trying to protect you, but maybe doing damage at the same time. Can you help us understand how we can get that chronic immune reaction under control?
In my study, again, I think herbs really have a lot of value. And when I say herbs, I also include medicinal mushrooms, and medicinal mushrooms are especially good for this. First of all herbs have antiviral properties because viruses are so ubiquitous in nature, and it's not one chemical, it's hundreds of chemicals. So the herbal phytochemicals and the phytochemicals in herbs can help suppress viruses. And that's not necessarily in the same category as a drug that treats an illness, a viral illness, but it can have some suppressive effects, and that helps the immune system. It helps calm it. But a lot of herbs are immune modulators, which basically means that they reduce those inflammatory cytokines. They have a balancing effect, and they basically cool down the immune system. So reishi, cordyceps, other kinds of adaptogenic herbs like rhodiola, ashwagandha have some nice effects in just cooling the immune system down and reducing that cytokine storm. But you're going to find that in all herbs to a certain extent. I've really come to appreciate that the main way that herbs work in the body, how we gain health benefits, is 3 primary categories. All herbs have some antimicrobial properties, some more than others. All herbs have antioxidants that protect cells at various different levels from the effects of free radicals, both external and internal in the cell. And all herbs have chemical messengers that mimic our hormone pathways and signaling agents, and they have a normalizing effect. So those are the important ways that herbs affect us, and we can use them for their health benefits.
Now, Dr. Rawls, our listeners are going, well, wait a minute. Is this guy a doctor? A medical doctor? I mean, he's talking herbs here, and that's not something he learned about in medical school. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you have come to find benefit from natural products.
Yeah, it is an interesting part of the story. I graduated from medical school and went into obstetrics and gynecology because it dealt more with wellness and less with drug therapy, though I really understood how to use the drugs. But the call associated with obstetrics and gynecology was pretty brutal, which ultimately led to my illness. Getting over the illness, I found that most pharmaceutical therapies just weren't helpful. And it really caused me to adopt this pathway toward herbal therapy. And since then, I've just had a passion for studying the benefits of herbs. But my approach has been more from a Western scientific point of view of, so much of traditional herbalism, and it has value, but it is mostly observational. We've used these herbs in the past to help with these symptoms or this kind of condition. So what I've pursued the way that I pursued it is, how do the phytochemicals, the chemicals inside the plant, how do those things affect things in the body that would cause us to find use for symptoms or that sort of thing? So my approach has been very different, and I've been just immersed in studying both microbial illnesses and herbs in general and what they're doing in the body for that second half of my career. It's been an interesting journey. I think there's a place for all drugs, no doubt about it, but they are more acute acting, and they address processes that result in symptoms, where with the herbs, what we're doing is addressing the causes of the symptoms. So it's very, very different.
A lot of your colleagues would say, but Dr. Rawls, there's no science, there's no research. There aren't those double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials that are essential to prove something actually works.
It is an argument, and the difficult thing is that to get those double-blind, randomized trials is extraordinarily expensive. And right now, the only people that have the money to do that are the drug companies. You need it with drugs. Drugs have the potential to kill people. They have a high potential for toxicity. So it's very important to get it right with a drug. You need that level of study. But when you're looking at herbs, most of the herbs that we're using, because they're reducing causes of illness rather than blocking processes artificially, the safety profile with herbs is very, very, very high. So first of all, it's hard to get in trouble with herbs. Second, the efficacy is greater than you can possibly imagine. There has been an explosion of study worldwide, and much of it outside of this country over the past 10 years, looking at how the phytochemistry of the herbs, the chemical makeup of the plant, is affecting various different stress factors, how it's affecting microbes, how it's affecting free radicals, how it's affecting different messaging pathways in the body. So there's a lot more research than you can possibly imagine. But it's not in that nice, neat form of, here we've taken this herb and we've used it to solve this symptom in this double-blind study. We're not seeing it, it's harder to find those because they're so expensive, but still lots of great information.
Now, Dr. Rawls, we have just a couple minutes left in our conversation. So please, would you summarize for us What can people do as they are recovering from COVID to minimize their possibilities of suffering long COVID?
It's a big thing is keeping your cells healthy. That's how I like to think about it. Keeping your cells healthy, which means nourishing your cells, eating a good diet that's high in natural foods and low in processed foods, getting plenty of rest, making sure that you're getting plenty of sleep at night, not overexerting your body. Clean environment. Just make sure that you're clean, your food, your water, your air is clean of toxins, because all of these interfere with cellular health. Give your body what it needs to fight that infection off. And on top of that, supplementing with herbs, some of the herbs that I mentioned, is a good way to protect to reduce the viral count, to protect the cells, and to help the immune system not get overactive so it becomes a destructive process. And then other nutrients like just selenium and vitamin D and vitamin C, glutathione and N-acetylcysteine have found to be important. Doing a comprehensive protocol that includes that will dramatically reduce the chances that this could be a chronic misery.
And just one more time, a little slowly so that people can capture it. Those herbs are, you said, Japanese knotweed, Chinese skullcap, what else?
Oh, there are a variety of herbs that we can use. The one I didn't mention that's always top of my list is ginger. Good old ginger tea. Just going and getting fresh ginger from the supermarket and making a strong tea out of it. Wonderful antiviral properties, but also there are a range of other herbs that are valuable. So andrographis is a well-known antiviral. Japanese knotweed has some antiviral properties. There are a whole list of other ones. Reishi mushroom, Chinese skullcap are a few others that have been found, but also anti-inflammatory herbs like turmeric can reduce inflammation. But it's hard to go wrong. And, fortunately, there have been studies that they have looked at quite a number of herbs, and they have found benefits across the board.
Dr. Bill Rawls, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Bill Rawls, a physician who overcame Lyme disease through natural herbal therapy. His books include Suffered Long Enough and Unlocking Lyme. His blog post is My Chronic Lyme Journey. Dr. Rawls serves as medical director for Vital Plan, an herbal supplement and wellness company he co-founded with his daughter Braden.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered, Dave Graydon edits our interviews, B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
And by Cocoa Via, offering plant-based nutrients in the form of cocoa flavanols for brain and heart health. Online at cocovia.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1245. That number again, 800-732-2334, on the web at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. Have you experienced chronic health problems following an infection? How did you manage? Share your story in the comments on the post for today's show.
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website every Monday morning. You might want to share it with a friend.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.